Great. So first of all, thank you very much for giving your time to attend this talk. So just to make sure that you know what this talk is on, it's on deep uncertainty, humility, and ethics. By way of background, my name is Mark Wortman, so I'm a specialist in strategic foresight. So basically, I use mixed methods to identify risks and opportunities in different possible futures. I'm not so much wedded to the parametric way of modelling that Imperial tends to advocate. I tend to like futures and qualitative type decision-making processes. In terms of my background, I am an economist and an engineer, not a particularly good one, educated to postgrad level, and then joined the military because I really despised the PhD process. And then I did a bunch of operational tours in light duty, in light role units, deployed on expeditionary warfighting in Afghanistan and Iraq. I then left after Iraq, and then ran a sort of a multi-million-dollar company out in Africa and Asia. And it was when I was in Africa and Asia that I started seeing climate change happen. It was just really obvious happening, and it was around Nigeria, around the Delta area. And it was already having a material impact on communities. I had the Stern Review in my backpack, whilst getting drunk and smoking with all the expats who were making way too much money. I decided to then come over to Imperial and learn about environmental economics. Having spent a little time in environmental economics, I realised that actually environmental economist specialists were also struggling to really understand what the topic was all about and how you value environmental services and such like. And I've been fortunate enough to be accommodated by a number of universities, of which Imperial is very kind and lets me stay here, hang around and work with some wonderful students. So that's kind of my background. In terms of what this is about and what the essence of this is this is the most simple version. I don't mean that to be patronizing. It's just that when you present issues regarding deep uncertainty, you tend to have a very cultural and axiomatic tension between people as to whether or not elements of the future can be predictable and whether or not they are actually a lot more indeterminate than perhaps we might admit. And so therefore, there are two sort of main things that I'd like to unpack during the session. Is how much can you rely on past data sets in order to characterize the future? All right, so you don't need to know that by driving a car, by using the rear view mirror, you are inherently going to have an accident. All right, and yet that's exactly what we tend to do with a lot of the parametric tools that we use to characterize net zero and the way that we're going to address that, particularly in the IPCC. And then the other thing we have to ask, bearing in mind that we've never done what we're seeking to achieve with net zero, and we're establishing a set of boundary conditions, whether it be the climate or whether it be within the economy, to realize net zero, do we really want to deploy our assets in order to completely focus on achieving an optimal outcome? Or would we rather deploy our assets in order to make sure it's as robust as possible, as in resilient to as multiple possible futures and uncertainties as possible? So I get this from my military background in terms of it takes far fewer resources deployed very differently when you're trying to make sure you don't lose a war than when you're actually deploying your assets to win one. You need a lot more resources and a lot of things need to go right to do that. And robust decision making, which accommodates exploratory modeling, adaptive management, and decision support, very much is posited around making sure that you have robust solution sets to address not only the exogenous uncertainties that might affect your plan, but also accommodating the multiple possible futures that may or may not come about. And what's really interesting is, though this community, the decision-making and the deep uncertainty community, has been going for about 20 years, the Iraq inquiry, the Chilcot inquiry, the COVID inquiry, Baroness Hazlitt's first report published on the 18th of July last year, and the Bernanke review have all stated that central projections and attempts to parametrically forecast outcomes using central projections is probably dead. All right, and that there's a need for something called, they don't actually say this explicitly, but it's implicit in what they said. There's a need for more scenarios focused decision making. It's actually stopping predicting pretending you can think about what the future might be and actually just generate how survivable your strategies might be in a range of possible futures, which you don't have to explain how they happen. You just say things like, there will be a 6-fold increase in gas prices because, for example, Russia invaded a certain small country that's being sold down the river by a certain president. So these are sorts of things that we just need to get our head around. And what I quite like doing, especially in small groups, is to do a bunch of exercises. So if we're so small, I'm going to actually do, what's your name? John. John, pleasure, fella. Very much giving it time. So just stand by on that exercise. So this is the most important thing. You all look a little bit too old to be called youngsters, though I'm now so old that you are relatively youngsters to me. So I always love my students to question everything I say. So because that is the best quote ever, and we don't do enough of that around the universities that I'm lucky enough to work around. So is anyone here familiar with System 1 and System 2 thinking? Yeah, okay. So Tversky, soulmate, ex-paratrooper, woohoo. He committed suicide in 1997, dying of degenerative disease. And then Kahneman died actually only recently at Princeton, age 90. So they came up with this idea of System 1 and System 2 thinking, whereby System 1 is more intuitive and habits and experiential based, and it shortcuts and allows a lot of survival type instincts to kick in. Whereas System 2 tends to be a more deliberative, thought, in-depth thinking type process, which enters the far more conscious part of the brain. You couldn't actually physiologically assign where System 1 and System 2 fitted in, but it is really important when you think about the way the models are used, how these two different systems kick in. I would argue that System 1 is very much where modelers design a model to generate these what-if scenarios that litter the academic literature and a lot of the forecasting literature, whether it be the finance sector, crisis management, and so on. And that unfortunately, System 1 then has a habit of kicking in, and we tend to then not interrogate the way these models are used. So just have this in the back of your mind. It's not absolutely vital. I'm just going to give you some examples of this. So I'm just going to point to people and ask you a quick question. So question 1, lady over there, what's the answer to that question? How much does the bat cost? Bat and ball costs £2.20 in total. Bat costs £2 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost?
10p.
Sorry?
Is it 10p?
It is 10p. Okay, a lot of people think it comes to about 20, because that's the heuristic kicks in, so that's cool. Okay, in a lake, there's a patch of lily pads. Every day, the patch doubles in size. If it takes 48 days for the patch to cover the entire lake, how long would it take the patch to cover a quarter of the lake? Anyone?
47.
Quarter.
A quarter. 46.
It is 46. Okay. And at Princeton, these questions got asked, and hardly anyone got them right. I think it was only like a third of the people in Kahneman Tversky's class that got them right. Okay, what's your name again?
John.
John. So if it takes 5 machines 5 minutes to make 5 widgets, how long would it take 100 machines to make 100 widgets?
Hundred is not the right answer.
It's not.
Um,
It's the temporal dimension which doesn't change, because it takes one machine 5 minutes to make 1 widget. So it's completely independent. It's 5 minutes. But heuristically, System 1 is telling you it's 100. So when I put people under real pressure, they always go 100. And I've done that with CEOs before, but no CEOs here. All right, the next question is, and John, this is you.
Yeah.
Can you use join all the dots with 4 continuous lines, please? Yeah, I've had that. You've had that in front of that all the time.
exactly.
Okay, very quickly.
Yeah.
Can you do it?
I mean, just draw vertical lines.
Destroy it on the thing I've given you.
All of them. Oh no.
Can you do it?
No.
Okay. Do you want to give the piece of paper over to that lady in the corner? She's confident she can do it. This is great. This is great.
Yeah.
Okay.
Doesn't matter which way they go.
No, not at all. And they're continuous.
Continuous.
Lines. Yeah. Okay, fine. Let's put it out your misery. So again, this is one that tends to catch a lot of people out. All right, and ultimately, is the fact that we're bounded by assumptions that don't necessarily exist. And my God, at science universities, we are really guilty about that. When a professor says this is a number, everybody believes them. No one challenges them. And ultimately, these hardcore assumptions are really dangerous for a lot of decisions that we're making. All right, another question. I have to go to the lady at the back. All right, two men play 5 checker games each. They both win an even number of games. How's that possible?
Games.
2 men play 5 checker games and each wins an even number of games. How's that possible? David?
Last one is a tie.
No.
Not playing with each other.
Perfect. So just breaking the assumption that they were playing against each other suddenly makes that a really easy thing. And again, the amazing students that are ridiculously overqualified here can't answer that question. They have a lot of convoluted issues. Right, one thing that we really need to do is to ensure that there's diversity in groups, all right? Particularly with the wicked problems that we've got and the complexity that we need to handle with regards to net zero. And I always ask people whenever I go into organisations, how diverse do you think we are? Everyone goes, yeah, we're really diverse. So let's just see how diverse you are. Think of a country beginning with the letter D. All right, think of an animal beginning with the second letter of the country's name from that previous step. What was the country and animal you thought of? Okay, Atia?
I was thinking of Denmark.
Yeah.
But I got in trouble.
Okay, got the animal?
Exactly.
You can't think of an animal beginning with E?
E.
Yeah.
Oh, it's like an elephant.
Okay, that's cool. Yes.
Uh,
It doesn't have to be different. If you thought exactly the same as Atia, that's fine.
nothing.
You didn't think of it, David?
Denmark too.
Okay, Denmark and elephant. That's exactly what most people think. And that's the basic, the branch of what you could have done. All right. And so there is a propensity, particularly, so I always laugh whenever I see, particularly finance sector, whereby you see a very culturally diverse set of people that all went to Oxford, all went to Princeton. And I guarantee you they'll all think the same, because they all read the same literature. So there is a need for massive diversity. We're not that good at it. So, right, that's just sort of mucking around really and playing around with how system 1 and system 2, which kind of underpins where the rest of the talk is going to go. So, it's a small group, so I'll allow this to, so we can allow this. So max paratrooper, so there are 3 levels by which you get understanding. Okay, the first level is same planet, same grid square. Basically, it's, sir, I'm right behind you, I'm right with you. All right, so you're following me. The next level is same planet, different grid square. Don't know where you are, boss, somewhere out there. All right, and then the last one is same grid square, different planet. Dude, you are so far gone, I can't see where you are. So just grade things when you understand things as to whether you're in one of those 3. All right, same planet, same grid square, same planet, different grid square, same grid square, different planet. It's just this speak, army speak. It's the same in the US Airborne Forces and it's the same in the British as well. Right, so hopefully the presentation will be sufficiently accessible that this will be self-evident, but just in case. So the arc of the narrative that I'm going to develop here is that climate change is happening at a far faster rate. Okay, Jim Ski basically said, chair of the IPCC, ex-professor here, we don't know why the oceans are as warm as they are. And we've got some of the best brains on the planet looking at this problem right now. And the models didn't pick it up. All right. Decarbonisation. Okay, we are really struggling to get CCS going. Carbon capture and storage, deeply infrastructure intensive. We've got 40 million tonnes of emissions taking place. That needs to scale to 4 gigatons in a lot of the net zero scenarios in 3 decades. That's going to be a lot of asset stranding in order to allow that to happen. And ultimately, the socio-political aspects of the transitions just are not being picked up. All right. And this is a brilliant quote in terms of, I think, Brian Hoskins, the brilliant climate scientist here, are we entering a period whereby the climate models are really struggling to assess the impacts going forward? And this, for me, is one of my favourite, let's go off pointer. This is one of my favourite papers. Essentially, is everyone here familiar with negative emissions technologies? Okay, negative emissions technologies essentially grab carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, okay, whether it be through some sorbent like an amine, and then it captures them and then concentrates them and then shoves them underground. And they can be technical removals like bioenergy carbon capture and storage or direct air capture. And what happens is that the process results in a net negative emissions layer. You're taking CO2 from the atmosphere and then putting it down, often with substantial energy penalty. You can also do it with nature-based solutions. So you can grow trees, you can then fix the carbon in some way and bury that carbon. Or you can just grow a tree, because that's actually resulting in the atmosphere having less CO2. So the integrated assessment modelling folks that provide a lot of the decision analysis for the for the IPCC third assessment report. Sorry, the IPCC Group 3 mitigation people. They've been putting negative emissions into their models since about 1998 to about 2000. When it exactly happened, no one knows, because no one really knows what's in those models. And yet, for some bizarre reason, having thrown them in those models for 20 years, and we now need these negative emissions technologies at gigaton scale. So we now need these negative emission technologies at a scale larger than the oil and gas sector and the agricultural sector combined. Probably going to struggle to do it. But the fact is, decision makers are saying we can hit our climate targets, and yet eventually they couldn't stop hiding the amount of negative emissions that were needed. And there is no industry around negative emissions. Eventually, one of the architects of a lot of the decision support in the IPCCs published in Nature Energy, you know what, maybe we should start talking about these negative emission technologies. Now, there's got to be something with the decision support process when they've been putting these tools within these models that are supporting decision support within the IPCC. And then 19 years after they've been doing it, they say, let's talk about this. That is just not, I mean, that's bordering on unethical, I would argue. So what is it that we need? You know, we need to question whether or not the orthodox methods conceal the existence of uncertainty. This is particularly salient at a time when uncertainties proliferating. Perhaps we need a broader toolbox. It's kind of why I use futures and qual methods as well, particularly exploratory modelling. And it requires us to basically develop a bigger toolkit. And I really do think that we need a more operational perspective, and we need far more participatory processes to do that. And the case we made in a minute. And the next point I'd like to make is that there are ultimately huge questions being asked regarding the present state of our decision support tools that we're using at the moment. All right. So this is a great one. Actually doing anything. So the global financial crisis, central projections. I don't know if you've had time. It's worth reading the Bernanke review. The Bernanke review basically said they're going to get rid of central projections. What's the problem with central projections? You're effectively anchoring all your thinking on the fact that that's likely to be the outcome, and then thinking of all the uncertainties beyond that. You know, what about tipping points and cascade effects and all those things that don't act in a linear way? All right, like global financial crisis. So ultimately, this is great. So in November 2007, a survey of professional forecasters examining 45,000 economic data sets foresaw a less than a 1 in 500 chance of an economic meltdown taking place in September 2008. All right, and ultimately, we obviously got the global financial crisis, and yet the conventional thinking, that groupthink, these economists said that was less than a 1 in 500 chance of happening. All right. And the Bernanke review is just basically say, just get rid of them. They're too dangerous now. And we're developing what we call scenarios-focused decision making. And in essence, what you're finding in common with a lot of these things is that in spite of long-run past data sets, all right, whereby we're trying to project onto the future and extrapolating, and we can't verify or develop any form of mechanism to therefore test and therefore quantify the risk. There's issues regarding the data is sparse. You don't even know whether you're measuring thing in an exact way. Because the structure of an economy shifts over time, you don't even know if you're measuring the right stuff. You know, complexity dynamics are such that the wheels are in motion regarding any aspect that may result in a tipping point and the flipping of the system into a new chaotic state. And you never know what actually caused that until it actually flips. So predicting is freaking crazy. And yet that's what we do. And all these issues are completely relevant to the way we think about net zero. So that's kind of the state. It's not great. So what are we going to actually do about it? So what I'm going to do now is just really strip down uncertainty. For those that you practitioners of uncertainty and risk, ultimately, all I'm going to do is take this construct called levels of uncertainty. And I would state that you can strip this down into 4 levels. So you have a level of which is more deterministic, and then that is indeterministic. How does a puff of smoke going to shape and evolve from someone's cigar? You could sit there all day, all year, all your life, and you will never be able to predict the way that smoke is going to evolve. So determinism, okay, you can generate a long run data set, for example, rolling dice. All right, you're going to get 1 in 6 outcome, but that 1 in 6 outcome actually needs to happen on a flat surface where the dice will fall on a single face. All right, and even the ability to get a 1 in 6 probability, if you've actually looked at the literature, takes about 500 rolls. So you need long run data in order to stabilize around that. So determinism, that's quite easy. You can develop simple regression analysis. Shallow uncertainty, right? This is like rolling a dice on a glass-bottomed boat, it's like glass-bottomed bowl, whereby the dice might actually cock on a rocking boat as well, where the dice might cock. You might go, is that a 1 or is that a 2? It's difficult, but you can actually, it's finite. The number of outcomes is finite, and you can probably use something like Bayesian type outcomes, more probabilistic type processes. And then there's this level called deep uncertainty, where you just need a little bit of ethics and a little bit of humility to say, you know what, we don't really know what how this system works and when it might fail in different possible futures. So I would argue that's like rolling a dice on the International Space Station. No one is going to be able to know when it's actually landed. It's completely subjective. And and ultimately it might even drift into outer space, overtaking the Tesla that Elon Musk has lit our space with. Right, so we just need to think about that. And the key thing is there's a lot of net zero that we simply don't know. And we need to be a lot more humble about that going forward. Now, it doesn't mean we can't do anything about it. When I say the question, how long is a piece of string, there's certain elements of the piece of string and properties that you know. It's half its length when you pull it in half. There's a beginning, there's an end, it's malleable. So there's still stuff that we can do as scientists in order to address that. We just need to stop pissing around and pretending that we can predict elements of that future. All right, so there's this construct called deep uncertainty. And in essence, there are 3 tests regarding uncertainty. Right, the first test, so this is a very legal construct. So ultimately, is there an agreement on the conceptual model by which a stimuli will result in a certain outcome? All right, if you ask, for example, if you ask 10 people, what's going to be the most important thing to realize net zero and to associate a probabilistic function to it, you get 10 different answers. And if they actually then were assessed with those 10 different answers to assign a probabilistic function between 0 and 1, across those 10 people, you would get 0.5 spread across 0 and 1. People just don't know what the main drivers are and what the outcome is going to be. Can you actually develop a PDF around it, a probabilistic distribution function? No. In chaotic systems, you do the same thing time and time again, and you get a different outcome. You don't get a probabilistic distribution function. And ultimately, you can't do that with the drivers and the stimulus and the outcome. And then what is a good outcome? For net zero, what is a good outcome? Is it really least cost? I think least cost is probably one of the least most important things, and yet that's the tool that we use. Is it about distributional effects? Is it about equity? Is it about co-benefits? These are the things, and ultimately you can probably break those down into place-based issues. To aggregate them up into a global construct is probably really naive, and yet that's exactly what we do. So if you are actually see those issues, and the moment that you get past what we call sort of shallow uncertainty, where maybe Bayesian processes, you realize that you probably need a different toolkit. All right, just be humble about the fact that we probably don't know, and therefore need to think about this in a different way. And so what I'm going to do now is start focusing on the difference between how you deal with consolidative approaches and essentially exploratory approaches. And ultimately, consolidative approaches are kind of what we use at the moment, where you build avatars of the future, and then you run what-if scenarios. And then you have exploratory approaches, which are just very different, and it kind of deals with a piece of string type question. All right. You still with me? Same planet, same grid square, same planet. Cool. All right. Excuse me, sorry. So levels of uncertainty is only one component. You know, and ex-military people get this, including corporals who haven't had the privilege of the amazing education and access to specialists that we do. Ultimately, net zero is a high dimensional issue. It is steeped in complexity. There are multiple dimensions. We've only unpacked levels of uncertainty. You can have complexity as well, and then you can have the variety of strategic options. And it gets high dimensional really, really fast. Essentially dealing with complex systems rather than complicated systems. All right. And the issue with complex systems is that they are prone to self-organization, nonlinear behavior, and the aggregate effects are highly anomalous. You don't know which things are going to be important at certain times. Sometimes they're tightly bound, sometimes they're weakly bound. And you go about addressing those in very different ways. So how are we going to address this? The first thing, and the tool I think I spoke to this about you, there are three different components, because there's been a lot of people advocating deep uncertainty approaches. And one of the main barriers to addressing the embedding of what, quite frankly, is a much better way of addressing the uncertainty that we face is that you need to deal with the modeling approach. And that's what I'm going to really go on to in the last 10 minutes of this talk. But in order for the modeling approach to work, you need to think about the system architecture, i.e. the way that decisions are actually made. How decisions are made. Some decisions require quick outcomes. COVID, we needed really good decisions. We had a completely lunatic in number 10 Downing Street, unfortunately. But the governance systems did eventually kick in to persuade that pretty awful Prime Minister of ours in order to kick in the relevant needs. All right. You also need the conceptual frameworks, as in you need to be able to ask the right questions. Because if you know your science, the moment you ask a question, you're already removing a lot of methods and a lot of issues and objectives that may be important to your study. And if you don't understand the decision space, you need to be really wary of that. So you need to ask the right questions, and this is pretty key. So with regards to sort of conceptual frameworks, this is key because traditional planning approaches, you start with the question, what will the future look like? And you have these amazing models where people think that they're able to run these scenarios through. And you basically start making predictions and you optimize, whereby you can generate some kind of sensitivity analysis. They work really well at that shallow end of uncertainty. But it's really easy to rig. My students forever show me their models and I go, how the hell did you get that number that you conveniently wanted? And you actually find out that they just parameterized it in a way. But I got the literature from the literature. Yeah, that's because those guys are developing a startup where they want to get funding. That's why it's so good. So ultimately, things like rolling out a policy, if a subsidy was to be introduced in the modeling with regards to this sort of process, all you do is you take the technology cost and then you just reduce it by the amount that the subsidy does it. And then the model fantastically just rolls out more of it within the process. The fact is, you've already baked in all the uncertainty around the way that you parameterize the model. So you're not actually exploring any uncertainty with regards to the way that the subsidy acts. All you're doing is just adding another layer of uncertainty onto a bunch of values-based decisions you made regarding that model. Exploratory approaches, you just say, right, I don't know how the future comes out. And what you then do is you focus on making the decision, okay? So what you actually then do, and I'll skip all this because I'll unpack this in the latter part of the talk. What you actually do is you test the uncertainties. You know, you just find out how the system works and what happens when you change things, all right? So whenever we show this stuff to policymakers or to the private sector, They always go, but that doesn't look right. So yeah, I know, but we know that the system does X, Y, and Z when we change this variable. It's not about being right and wrong. It's about thinking about how the decision that we get made and how it behaves within the system, accommodating for the uncertainties within the decision that we get made, and most importantly, the different futures that might come about. Okay, so I'm going to kind of unpack that now. And when they get it, they never go back to this approach. It takes about 3 months to unpack all that hardwiring of cultural education in the amazing universities that we have, just don't teach the stuff as well as they should do. So I'm now going to go into the modelling approach. So that's about asking the right questions. This is about how you think, what the actual modelling approach and the difference between these consolidative approaches that sit in that low level of uncertainty, and then exploratory approaches which sit in the sort of higher end and deep uncertainty. So what you actually have is tend to have an optimization approach with fixed assumptions, all right? And they have perfect insight, perfect information, and more importantly, they have absolutely the ability to reallocate where markets close down straight away and new markets are constructed, and the resources around that happen instantaneously. Okay, the closest economy in the world that allows that to happen is the American one. The European economies are so steeped in terrible planning laws that are put for good reasons, prevent the reallocation of resources and assets, and our employment laws are a lot more protective than perhaps the American ones. So you think about those sorts of things and you figure out the likely possible future. And the conceptual framework is steeped in neoclassic economics, where ultimately, if everybody, if there's a net positive, that's good for everybody, despite the fact there's probably huge distributional variation in that. And the question you're asking is, what's likely to happen? And essentially, you just generate these very fragile predict and act type mindsets. It's akin, for those that rock climb, okay, it's akin to climbing a rock face, just using a bunch of telescope lenses there, not accommodating for the fact that there might be an overhang ahead, there might be rock fall, there may be smooth faces, but ultimately you're just going to bend it into that thing. So that's essentially what predict and act and what optimization models do. And optimization models dominate the space, all right, the decision support space. And you get these things like this. You get these beautiful outcomes. And so this is extracted from the 6th carbon budget, the Committee on Climate Change's 6th carbon budget, all right, where they essentially anticipated, those things called the negative emission technologies that I talked about earlier. Well, globally, we need about 6 to 8 gigatons, 6 to 8 billion tons of CO2 removed from the atmosphere. Farming sector, agriculture sector, and the oil and gas sector in reverse in 30 years, or 25 years now. So in the UK, we need about 60 million tons of negative emissions from technical removals and about 40 million tons from nature-based. So we're going to grow more trees. We're going to use peatlands, restore peatlands. And so what you do is you get these lovely wedge diagrams. You need about 23 million tons of BECCS with electricity. You need 23 million tons. The detail of the technologies is not important. It's the way it gets presented. And ultimately, you look at that and you go, well, blimey, just make it happen. It's pretty easy. And so ultimately, you have to ask the question, all right, are these black boxes? I mean, if it's that freaking simple, then why don't we just do it anyway? The fact is, you're not invited into the decision space. So how do you address this? Ultimately, you can apply something called a robust decision-making approach, which is a form of exploratory modeling. And you explore and manage rather than characterize the deep uncertainty. Uncertainty is inherent. You can never get rid of it. We have this pathological desire to get rid of it. All it happens is it just pops up somewhere else. All right, you can't. Every soldier that deploys on a military operation knows that the moment you engage with the enemy. And yet, for some bizarre reason, across all other sectors, we are trying to just beat it out of us. And it's really dangerous, particularly for the caliber of engineers, financial or otherwise, that we need to address net zero. And you're looking to find out why you're vulnerable. But when you're rock climbing, you take off those stupid goggles and you're looking around. You're looking, what are the issues? Mate, what do you see that I can't see? All right, you're trying to look at that. So, oh, if we go that route, that possible future, that's going to come about. If we go this future, that might come about. All right, and you're thinking about the range of possibilities. What's the weather like? If you're wearing those goggles, you have no idea. You don't think about those possible futures. And you're trying to minimize regret and assess assumptions. You want to know where your uncertainty is coming from. all right, or where it may come from, all the sorts of uncertainties, the known unknowns, all right, and then you just have to adapt the unknown unknowns. And all you're trying to do is work out when our system works, and more importantly, how the decision behaves within those futures. So the big issue here is you're agreeing on decisions. So you flip the analytical construct. Instead of trying to predict and think about the way the world works, you go, let's make a decision. For example, a technology portfolio. This is the futures cone, and these dots represent different possible futures. And then you fly that technology portfolio through these futures, and then you co-generate a bunch of metrics, and you work out how that technology portfolio works in that future and how it behaves along these metrics. And you can see that there's huge trade-offs. And more importantly, you're invited into the uncertainty space. You know, you have that wide vision, that panoramic vision, the curvature of space, sense of uncertainty. And you're always looking to propose the strategy and think about the decision context, right? And you're using the analysis to stress test your decision because you can control that. That is something that you can, you know, with a degree of humility and ethical standing, say, yes, the decision we can actually make. Let's figure out how it performs in different possible futures. I've got students do this in 3 months. Okay, he was a very bright student from the École Polytechnique, and they are technically brilliant students. And in essence, this is what we did. So we took this and that exactly the same analysis. We decided, the student basically, Bastian, he was brilliant, it's his work. He said, right, Mark, water use is really important. The amount of land use that those technologies are going to require, technology readiness level is really, really important because obviously the higher you got the TRL, the bigger the amount of finance needed. Plant margin, how much of the electricity system we are going to draw on in order to realize these technologies. The indexed emissions, this is basically net zero, and then anything minus is greater than net zero, so that's good. And then these are the costs. And so what you've effectively got is you've got exactly the same plot, but you're unpacking what you call doing something called vulnerability analysis. You know what? In order to deliver that, the water sector is in deep shit. We need about the amount of water that we use in the residential sector again. So how are we going to address that? Because the direct competition. Land use, blimey, there's a lot of uncertainty here as to how much land we're going to use. This is obviously indexed relative to the UK, but even if we were going to get, you know, what are we, 24 million hectares, even if we're going to try to source the reason it's so large, it's not only the technical footprint, it's not only the plant footprint, it's the larger footprint, like the amount of biomass that needs to get grown. But ultimately, blimey, we need about 18 million hectares of land in potentially, or about 6 million hectares of land in order to realize this footprint. As a decision maker, you're starting to go, bloody hell, there's a lot of issues we need to think about. TRL 6, Jesus. Okay, you're in the commercial valley of death there. You've got no income at TRL 6 because the business model isn't proven, and you're struggling because you're outside the VC range and you're falling short of the institutional investor range of about 10 to 100 million quid. All right, so Jesus, actually TRL, we need to throw a shitload of innovation at this. Plant margin, some of the scenarios and the uncertainties take us outside, so we need more research and insight regarding how to address that. Actually, on emissions, we're fine. Just as well, because the Committee on Climate Change did that initial analysis. My goodness, there's a massive uncertainty on cost. And we are a fiscally constrained country with an aging population, all right? And I'm unfortunately one of the people that's going to be a drain on the economy. And yet, look, it could cost anything from about 38 billion quid a year to 25. We need it nearer 25. So we need to actually address some of those uncertainties, which is probably related to TRL. All right, so can you see how it completely changes the dialogue? You are looking at the way the portfolio behaves, and all you're doing here is looking at the exogenous uncertainties. What you can then do, and this is what Bastian kind of did off his own back, though he read some of the literature, is you can take different portfolios and generate something called robustness. And robustness is the ability for your decision, whether it be a strategic decision or whether it be a technology portfolio, to then be able to survive across those different futures. And what you can do is you can change the mix. So the 6th carbon budget is based on BECCS power, 23 million tonnes a year, BECCS hydrogen, 23, DAC, direct air capture, about 5 million tonnes, and then enhanced rock weathering and biochar around 0. And Bastian started playing around with these numbers. And he essentially took the 6th carbon budget and said, well, ultimately, that's sat around quite high water, land use could be quite low. TRL, okay, all kicking around the 6, so we need to throw a lot more money at this. Plant margin, we're good. Emissions, we're good. Still a big spread in terms of the cost. All right. And it's in essence, then, which one performs better? So let's look at B. B, that's a lot better for water. So if we have a more drought-ridden future, we kind of want maybe portfolio B. Land use is also good in land. So basically, we're drawing on less land, whether it be the UK or from offshore with regards to importing biomass or whatever is upstream. TRL, a bit low. So we need to look into that. Plant margin, it's okay. Emissions, it's good. And it's green. And the cost could be quite high. So again, what you're developing here, and there's no right or wrong. It's a bunch of decisions that the decision makers make, and there's called values-based decision making, which Keeney wrote about in 1992, and yet it's completely taken off the table when you use optimization approaches. So that is essentially the nub of exploratory modeling. And I just need to basically say that the reason that we really struggle to get this, or the community of practice has really struggled to get this going, is because in order to better adapt these processes, we also need to be thinking about those conceptual frameworks and those governance systems. There's probably another talk in itself. And ultimately, what this really boils down to, and it's something that I think Imperial is really struggling on, and it's going to even more so because somehow it's managed to get a number 2 in the world rankings, whatever that means, is we need a more philosophical construct. It's the reason I really like working at other universities. You know, I mean, Oxford can be a pain in the arse, but they are really humble because they actually understand ethics and philosophy. And that's something really glaringly missing at Imperial. And having done my engineering degree at PhD level, I actually start reading more of the classics, Aristotle, Plato, right, I can't remember. One of them didn't write. I think Plato wrote Socrates' all his Socrates' thinking. But in essence, we need to think about what's unknown and unknowable. And if it's unknowable, we need to use exploratory approaches and actually just agree on that. And a lot of the stuff produced around net zero is unknowable. We need to actually understand that there are limits to scientific knowledge. You can't scientize the crap out of everything. There are some things that just sit within the realms of philosophy. And being sat around and talking about it is actually probably as powerful thing as you can do. And yet somehow we do think, mainly because in the 50s, we decided to take the Einstein way of thinking about it rather than the Walt Disney kind of qualitative way of thinking about things. Yeah, how you integrate ethics and humility into policymakers, particularly with the caliber of leaders we have at the moment, is a very big question. I don't think I have the answer to that. I don't think I'm qualified. And ultimately, there is a cultural issue about how we informed analysis for political and policy type decisions. And we definitely need a lot more multidisciplinarity. You know, this university is fantastic, but we are really narrow. And that's not only us, you know, we're bloody good at what we're bloody good at, but we are really weak at the stuff that we don't have. And I really would advocate that we do bring those sorts of things. And that's kind of a call to the blue box. They will advocate that we do partnerships. It's not enough. You need to be in the same room, absolutely going hammer and tongs as to whether it's the right thing, wrong thing, if that's even possible. Okay, and it is that cultural construct, and leaders need to do that. And it's a brilliant paper. It's from Stanford, and at Stanford you can actually do. When I work at Stanford, you can meet engineers that do philosophy. You can't do that in the UK and Europe. I mean, Stanford's one of the few places you can do that. MIT, they would struggle, and Princeton, that they are kind of guilty of what Imperial's a bit like. So, coming to an end, I hope I haven't killed you. If we keep using the decision support tools that we're using, we're going to conceal uncertainty and constrain optionality. You know, we need to bring people into decision space. And paradoxically, you're actually hardwiring systemic risk into the system. And we've done that with the IPCC and the adherence to the integrated assessment models. There is a better need, and it really annoys me how these students, the wonderful students that we recruit here, they just want to use a tool. I go, mate, what's the problem space? I want to spend the first half of this project just understanding the problem. And then you can start telling me about the sorts of tools. Yeah, but I want to use this. It's fantastic. I read the paper. I don't care. If it's the problem, it's not right. We're going to use a different tool. right? So we need to do that. And I mean, and you know, say the students about that, but I think that probably sits within some of the professorial chairs that we have here as well. And ultimately, we need to codify this broader decision toolbox. It's something that Jim Skee has advocated within the IPCC, but still the funders just like these bloody models. So it's actually down to a cultural thing. And we ultimately just need to start creating capacity to understand deep uncertainty and generate more robust policy around both net zero and investment decisions. There you go. 45 minutes. Still on the same planet, same grid square? Okay, that's very polite of you to say. So yeah, I'll just leave it at that because I've thrown everything at you in about 40 minutes. Hopefully that landed. You politely nodded. Are there any questions? That's rubbish.
I just find it very interesting in an age where, because I mean, some of the modeling now with the artificial intelligence or the so-called artificial intelligence, it can easily be taken over by artificial intelligence. And in a place where society is seemingly thinking they're going to rely and make more use of this tool, this is what we need. And I'm just curious to see if it frees up time and thinking capacity to think deeper, or is it just going to be a very lazy reliance on AI type of, and just more of the same? It's just Zulandi.
Zulandi, that's a fantastic question. So it's a question I inherently get asked when doing the tour in the US and the UK. So ultimately, AI may be a tool, but we need to use it in the right way. And the paradox is that because we use these sort of web scraping type AI tools, we are actually going to really struggle to know what synthetic data and what is actually ground truth data. That's the biggest problem that we've got. So AI, there are three components that AI really adds to some of this analysis. One, scale and speed. You know, you can access a truckload of data, and that data can be shit, or it can be really, really good. AI doesn't give a flying. It's just going to scrape it, give it to you. So that's the way you can achieve a lot of scale as well. So you're able to access it very quickly. The reason that you have the behavioral economics ontology and discipline is because no one knows what constitutes a good decision. And does it improve decision making? It depends on how you use it. And I would argue that actually AI, and some of my students, amazing as they are, and they have to teach me how to do this, they've actually used AI to think about how you can generate robust decision making, and actually using it to generate scenarios and using what they call morphological analysis, where you literally use through brute force of what the possible futures are going to be, strip out the ones that are not possible, and then throw them at your strategic decision, is a really powerful way of doing it. But even then, I want to be able to track how that scenario, that decision portfolio performs in specific scenarios.
In that sense, I mean, that's why for me it's not artificial intelligence, it's machine learning, because and that's what what the whole thing is about, uncertainty. So artificial intelligence or machine learning can only use what's there already, and it doesn't account for deep uncertainty, which
Okay. So you probably highlighted the flaw in my knowledge of the difference between artificial intelligence and machine learning. So yeah, I would.
Well, for me, from my perspective,
Because
it makes use of something that exists already, and it can only create in so far as it can create from what it exists.
Mm-hmm.
And what makes humans different is that uncertainty, that unpredictability, and that's why, in my opinion, it will never be intelligent, and that's why. If it comes up with a whole different lots of scenarios, maybe it will be slightly better than you will get out of the average. You have to have a workshop, but I strongly doubt if it can really bring that ability, that black swan, that deep uncertainty.
But yeah, I'm probably on the same page, but as a Scotch or Scotch, or maybe we're honoring distillery discussion. Anyone else? Yeah.
This very last decision, investment decisions. In the end, does it not rely on the behavior of the average citizen, the people. If they, whatever the policymakers make, if the person who is buying investment today, and if they don't change that behavior, how does that factor into this thinking?
So you're talking about societal acceptance of possible trajectories. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
Yeah. So all I've done at the moment is talk about the modelling aspect. I don't know if I'm going to have time next week. I'm going to give another talk on this. So there's a function within the robust decision-making approach whereby you engage with stakeholders, and this is where there is a slight flaw in the process, or there's a limitation. It's not a flaw; it's a limitation in that. For example, on water catchment areas where you apply robust decision-making and exploratory approaches, if you're going to generate a new reservoir within a site, you obviously need to generate supply and demand, so you can speak to farmers, the biggest consumers of the water, and other consumers. And then you can think about the supply side as well, probably includes farmers. And you can then workshop, and then you can unpack these uncertainties as a part of that. When you go through a process called deliberation with analysis. And this is where our conversation right at the beginning about the resource intensiveness of this, whereby you can unpack these uncertainties and you can talk about which portfolios different communities would consider to be more preferable as a function of their place-based, contextual and values-based thinking. So you can allow these things to be unpacked and say, for example, which one would, for example, the local community might prefer strategy B because it has a smaller footprint, uses less water, so that those are things drains of resources on the local need. Policymakers might prefer it because it's cheaper. It's not in this particular case. But policymakers at the national level may go, no, we want it to be cheaper. So therefore, there needs you've identified a local issue which is in tension with a policy issue, which you don't necessarily pick up with the other approaches, but somehow you can maybe find, let's co-develop between national policymakers and the local community another strategy which addresses the needs of both national policymakers with regards to cost and local communities with regards to environmental effects coming about. So that does require a series of workshops. So my colleague who works at, in the water sector does this all the time for multi-billion pound investments where they work with the communities in order to address these things. I mean, the challenge and the big question we always get, how do you scale that? And that is the $64 million question, because if we are as much trouble as we probably are with net zero and the possible transgression of tipping points, we probably need to get this rolled out as quickly as possible, which goes again the ability to be able to have these conversations and deliberative processes. So yeah.
So where I'm going with that is that at the end, there's a supply and demand. So you know its background, right? There has to be a price for it. It's a price that at the bottom.
Well, ultimately, the models will be able, the modelling, and then there's a part of the process where you say, what are the important metrics to you, and what are the tolerances within those metrics? And as part of that process, it's called an XLRM process. This is where we need a bottle of wine to talk you through, whereby you say, right, what are the exogenous uncertainties? What are the metrics? What are the levers? And what sort of model do we want to use in order to explore the decision space? And this is what Bastian did. And ultimately, what you then do is you then talk to these communities, and when you start the process, you say, what are you willing to tolerate? And then you can put different bars on that to then work out, well, that community ain't going to have that. So, these are the things that we need to look at in order to address that. And yeah, I mean, at the moment, governments, bond yields are going to be highly volatile, both not only political instability, but because 100% of GDP, a tiny increment change in interest rates results in massive cost to national debt. So yeah, those things are increasingly salient. But again, we should probably unpack that over a longer conversation. That's a good question, though.